Hi, my name is Ben Kiel, partner at XYZ Type. I'm speaking to you today from St. Louis, Missouri in the United States. I want to begin by acknowledging that the land I'm speaking from is the occupied territory of the Osage Nation, the Missouria, and the Illini Confederacy. In addition, I want to take a minute to ask you, if you have the means, to consider donating to India right now. Lastly, I want to thank the organizers of this conference for all their hard work and the acceptance of this talk. I'm going to be talking about the UFO format and the collection of open source packages going under the name roboTools, which, to be clear, is not, nor am I talking about today, roboFont, the font editor. Before I begin, I want to be clear that I'm speaking personally, not as a spokesperson from the projects I'm talking about. Nothing I say is the official stance of the UFO project or the roboTools project. I will also likely be getting some dates and facts completely wrong. Those errors are all on me. I'm speaking about and from my personal experience with these projects and where I see them fitting into the landscape of type technology today. All credit for these projects goes to the people who have invested time and effort into their continued growth and maintenance. This past summer, we had a large and long Zoom meeting about the UFO format. It was wonderful to see the community and begin to work out changes and fixes to the format, which were long coming. That meeting, unfortunately, didn't allow for a discussion of where the format came from and how it functions as a communal benefit for the typeface design community. There are times where I feel like the origins and benefits of the format are lost in the day-to-day discussions of both typeface designers and those working on the technical side of typeface development. It can seem like people think UFO equals RoboFont, when this is both historically and actually not really the case. As an aside, I also feel, and it's probably likely I read way too much Twitter, that font editors are treated often like sports teams, things to be rooted for or against. I'm on team this, I'm on team that. I think it's useful to pause and consider how fortunate we currently are in the number and range of the font editors available to designers. The list on the screen is likely incomplete, apologies to those I forgot, but it's really long. We have never been in an age where we had this number of font editors to use. I find it discouraging that the cost of an editor, whether free or expensive, or the platform it runs on, is used as a pejorative in online discussion to describe an editor. These are all complicated projects, all made by very small teams or individuals, and all for a software market that frankly we all know is not huge. There isn't a large fortune to be made by making a font editor. We're lucky to have the wide varieties of options that exist. I say all this while also acknowledging that there are real issues around equity when software and hardware is expensive. I do think, however, that we can have that conversation without denigrating the options that exist or badgering them to become things that they can't be or aren't. All right. Now I think to understand what the UFO format is, we need to look at where the UFO format came from. The kernel of the format originally came from the Twin Cities project from around 2003, a project that Erik van Blokland and Just van Rossum did when they were living in two different places, and they needed a way to exchange glyph data. Often just a couple of glyphs at a time. I drew this, can you put this in? I need this glyph, etc., back and forth. Exchanging full font files for this sort of thing is ridiculous, and it makes it really hard to keep track of what's where and what needs to go in what place and which is the most recent file. I don't know. Final.final.final. So they developed a simple XML representation of glyph data that they could just email back and forth. That was the precursor to the UFO, a simple solution made by typeface designers to the problem of distance. I think it's useful to pause here and just remember that there's a lot of power in thinking about tools from the point of view of where our workflows really stop working. Those pain points often point to gaps in a tool or gaps in a workflow. And often a type designer, while maybe not being a programmer, can point to those and get help. After a bit, Tal Leming joins the UFO project, and it really starts to become a formally specified thing in 2004 as UFO 1. As a format, admittedly, it was not very precise, and nor did it capture all the data that was in a font. It was fairly simple and not entirely robust. However, it worked for the use that Erik, Tal, and others had at that time. And that was really to get font data out of font editors and into standalone applications that they were building. For example, Metrics Machine or Superpolator. The specification becomes more formal with UFO 2, which was published in 2009, and then UFO 3, which made a lot of changes in 2012. That version of the format is still being edited and added to, and there's also UFO 4, which is currently in development. The format has grown more formal over time. UFO 3 is the most formal and strict, really based on the experience that Tal and Erik had while they were working on the WAF specification. All right, so that's a brief history. But what good is the UFO? What is it for? Why do we have this thing? The mission goal of the UFO is a cross-platform, cross-application, human-readable, future-proof format for storing font data. In my view, I see this as two things: interchange and archiving. Both of these things put a typeface design files at the core. Design files have a lot of metadata about the workings of a typeface design that are not in the final font file that is shipped to a customer. These are things like sketches, images in the background, notes, layers, your overlaps, unused glyphs, whole unused designs, intermediate masters, trials, tests, so on and so forth. As a designer, you want to work, for the most, on your design files, not your font binaries. The font binary is the final thing that goes out to the customer, but doesn't represent the totality of the work you put in. So interchange. The UFO, because it's not tied to a font editor, allows you as a designer to have different pieces of software that can work on different areas of your design. We saw that with Metrics Machine and Superpolator, which were a tool for kerning and a tool for interpolation that did different things than what a font editor did at the time. It kerned differently than FontLab, and it did interpolation differently than FontLab too. This idea of an interchange format isn't something that is at all unique or new to software. We can see this in a lot of different spheres. So Pixar has a format called USD that they use for exchanging 3D scene descriptions. And what's really funny is that format is strikingly similar to the structure of the UFO. It uses packages in a similar way. I think another really useful mental model is a MIDI, which is a way of connecting. I don't actually understand how MIDI works. It breaks my brain. But a way of connecting a bunch of very different things together: musical instruments, software interfaces, keyboard synthesizers, music editors, all sorts of things, video, into very complicated workflows that are unique to a musician or an artist. And it's a really simple format. It's like basically just cables. Even though it's simple, it allows for really complicated and interesting things to be made. So interchange allows complex workflows to work when you want to tie a bunch of different things together. So now archiving. Fonts have a long life. Case in point, this is my PostScript copy of Triplets Condensed. I also have a floppy disk for Mrs. Eves, which I bought in 1996 to set my high school newspaper in, which is, yes, possibly the worst of any typographic combination for a newspaper, but I was a high school Emigre fanboy. Those fonts still work on my computer today. So designers and companies realize that their font design data is probably the most important asset that they have. It allows for longevity to one's career. Being able to go back to your design files and extend a family, add glyphs, add script support, fix things, whatever, is critical to your working life. You can do that with font binaries, but you're working at a disadvantage because you don't have all your design information. I know it seems a bit alarmist to say, what happens when you can't open your files? That would never happen. But if you've been around for a bit, you know that this is the exact situation that was faced by UFO 1. The industry was switching from Fontographer or roboFog to FontLab, but the Fontographer file format was undocumented and really basically just a memory dump of the state of the program at the time you hit save. The pressure was also on because Fontographer only ran on OS 9, not on OS X. So if you didn't have access to a computer that ran OS 9, all you had were your font binaries to go back to, losing all your design work. This happened, and it's going to happen again, I'm sure. I don't want it to happen, but it's likely to. So one complaint that sometimes we see about the UFO is that it is based on XML. And some of that is we're all nerds and we all have our preferences and things, but I know XML is like fussy and sometimes hard to work with. Why didn't we use JSON? Why isn't it YAML or whatever? Part of this is due to what was easy to work with or actually invented at the time. The UFO format tries to stay with things that are open source, documented formats or specifications to preserve longevity. So I know XML can be fussy, but it's kind of like a cockroach after a nuclear blast. It's everywhere and not going anywhere. Any programming language is going to have an XML reader and writer because the format is so ubiquitous that you just have to have one. So if a font editor has a scripting layer, you're going to be able to write out XML or read XML, which means you can write out and read a UFO. XML is also text, so it's not a binary, so you can read it and hand edit it. I know not a lot of people actually hand edit a UFO, but it's useful to go in and find something. Simple find and replaces work really well. There's a beauty to editing text. It's simple and easy to understand. So these two features of the format have really coalesced in my head as this idea of a typographic commons. And really it should be type technology commons, not a typographic commons, but so we go. So I teach at Washington University in St. Louis, and this semester I'm teaching a class called Printing Propaganda, where we examine messaging and rhetoric through printing posters in a letterpress studio, which is my favorite thing. One of my students, Noah Jodis, this semester has been working with this idea of the commons, and the students pick a topic and they work for it for the entire semester. And so these are some of the sketches pulled from our shared class mirror board of some of the posters that he's been making for class. So I was familiar with this idea of the commons, but in engaging with Noah over the semester has really made me start to think about where the commons is in a bunch of different areas of my life. I've pulled this definition of the commons from Commons Magazine because I think a couple things really stand out. It's this idea that there are community resources that need to be protected and managed for the good of all, and that hopefully those resources will last for generations to come. So I see this future-proofing, application independence, and exchange and interchange features of the UFO as this idea of the commons. It provides a not complete, it's not everything, but this grounding technology that we can all use to talk to each other, whether we're only working in open source software or if we're working in proprietary software or anywhere in between. It's something that we can all use together. Where is the UFO now? Going through some things. How do you read and write a UFO? There are a couple packages for doing this. There's UFO lib, which is the longest running one. That's now part of FontTools, and it's written in Python. There's NORAD, which is written in Rust, being used for the RuneBender application. Rust seems to be the new hotness. There's UFO Kit, which is written in Swift. And there's UFO.js, which is written in JavaScript. So there are a bunch of different packages that can read and write UFOs. To the best of my knowledge, and I could be wrong about some of these, are the editors that have native, so they use the UFO as their file format. That would be Metaplator, RoboFont, RuneBender, and TrueFont, and other font editors that can read and write, but don't use the UFO as their native format. And that would be Glyphs, DTL Font Tools, Font Creator, FontForge, FontLab. Again, I'm probably missing some. So it's this format that has been this box that if you're making a font editor, you want to tick because your users want something that can read and write to these things. And we also see the UFO in a lot of Foundry workflows. So you can see this most publicly in the workflows of the Google Fonts project. And I know there's going to be a talk about that during this conference. But you also see it in the workflows of Dalton Mogg, who do a lot to contribute to open source software around type technology, which is always great. And other foundries that maybe aren't so public, but are building tools and using the UFO in their production workflows. A couple things have been added to the UFO, some of this recent, some of this not. There's now a UFO Z, which solves the problem of Dropbox hating the UFO. So the UFO can be thousands of files, or a collection of UFOs can be many thousands of files, small files, that Dropbox, which a lot of people use, does not like whatsoever. UFO Z is a zipped version of the UFO, so it's a single file that works better for things like Dropbox. It's not great, obviously, for things like version control because it's just a binary blob. PostScript hinting has been in the specification for a while, but we have just recently added TrueType hinting. Both of those have taken a while because we're waiting and not really ever getting to an open specification, especially for TrueType hinting. So an open source specification that we can point to. This is the thing you should do for TrueType hinting. This is what we're going to do. So right now it exists in the UFO as TTX dumps, but people invest a lot of money in TrueType hinting. It's nice to have that as something that can be used. But there's a bunch of things that are not solved in the UFO. It's not a perfect format. It's not the perfect format for everyone, and it has some warts, like any project does. You can see that right now, currently, there are 34 issues open, some major, some minor. There are things to be worked on. Right now, it doesn't have a great way of encoding variable fonts. And so variable fonts, the design space format references UFOs, but UFO doesn't have really any knowledge about what a variable font is or how to deal with it. So right now, all that logic is in the design space file, and it feels like at this point, some cracks are starting to show there. So there's work to be done there. SVG color fonts and color fonts in general, work needs to be done to figure out the best way to encode those formats. And I can tell you from working on a SVG color font over the summer that UFO will work for it, but it's not the easiest thing sometimes. Vertical metrics, and I don't mean the normal vertical metrics, but really what I mean is vertical typesetting. And the support for that is in the format, but it's not as good as it could be, and that hurts scripts like CGK. And I think a big one right now is a format validator, and I think this may just be a personal bugaboo I have, but because more and more things are writing UFOs, having a validator for the format so a tool will know that it's writing a valid UFO, especially as more and more reading and writing libraries are being created, will be a really useful thing, and we don't have that. And I think that is somewhat problematic and could lead to some fragmentation. And the UFO, in a way, because it's one glyph, one file, when you have something that has a large number of glyphs, it can be slow and hard to deal with a lot of them. Some of this comes down to common things you want to know, like a CMAP table, so you can map things. You don't really want to look at all 64,000 glyphs in a file. You just want to be like, okay, I need this glyph for this Unicode, just tell me where it is. So there's some changes that we're talking about for UFO 4 to deal with that. And I think another sort of sore spot with the UFO is this idea of design versus production. And so UFO, I think, is really well suited for encoding design information or archiving design information and interchanging things between design applications. But if you're doing something large and complex, and FontMake is running into this in certain areas right now, it may not be the best thing for production. It can cause some slowdowns, and sometimes that may actually just be in the tools and not the format. But I think thinking about a different format for production, which is by definition throwaway, you're just like having intermediate files till you get to the final binary, versus your design storage where UFO is probably a little bit more suited. There could be work done there. What are the blind spots of the UFO? So every project has blind spots, and it's funny to talk about this because if they're blind spots, we can't see them. So I think one big thing that comes up a bunch are editor-specific features. And really, it's not a blind spot because this is by design. The UFO is something that's meant to be archival. An editor that does a proprietary thing to outlines a special thing, storing that can't, by definition, be universal. So unless an editor wants to release a specification so that other font editors can do its special thing, it's pretty hard to encode that in the UFO. I will say the format does have areas for editors to put special data that maybe only that editor can read or know how to understand. There is a lib and there is a data section for fonts and glyphs. And I think we're going to add some more libs to contours and points. Libs for everything. That would help in storing editor specific features, but by definition, another editor isn't going to be able to do anything with that. So that's a blind spot. I think a big one right now is right to left scripts and vertical scripts. So right now there are things in the UFO to handle right to left and vertical scripts, but we've made some errors in the specification, especially when it comes to kerning, and vertical kerning is not handled right now. And so this is a big blind spot that we would really love to have subject matter experts help us with so that we do the right thing. We thought we were doing the right thing with kerning, and we screwed that one up in UFO 3, so it's going to need a fix. I think the specification process itself, not necessarily a blind spot. Again, I think externally it feels like a blind spot. It moves slow, and it's slow partially by design. We don't want to put things in the format that we're going to have to take out later because we want the format to be archival, that you want stability. And stability usually means slowness. And I know that can be really frustrating to a lot of people. Why isn't it handling variable fonts? Why is it not doing that? Why isn't it taking so long for this to happen? So sometimes that's because of design, and sometimes that's because we're really busy and haven't had a chance to get to it. The UFO format is developed by volunteers who aren't getting paid, and so sometimes things are slow because of that. I know there are more blind spots, but it's really hard to know what the blind spots are, so I'm very curious to see what you might have in the Q&A in terms of blind spots or things you really don't like about the format and want to be fixed or changed. So I think another big part of this idea of the commons are the open source tools around the UFO. So we've talked about the format a lot. We're going to talk about roboTools much quicker. But roboTools, again, is not RoboFont, but it's a set of packages that have been developed around the UFO for doing various things involving the UFO format and in building tools on Mac OS for editing fonts or doing strange things to fonts. And most of these have been developed by Tal Leming, Erik van Blokland, Just van Rossum, and Frederick Berlin, but there also have been a lot of community involvement. So I just want to run through a couple of those tools. One that's really close to my heart is Font Parts because I've invested a lot of time in that, and I call it Python Font API for the rest of us. And a lot of people are used or have used roboFab scripting API, and so that's a scripting API that came out of what roboFog did, and roboFab was developed for FontLab, and it hit a point where adding it to other font editors was getting tricky, and Python 3 was coming, and UFO 3, and so Font Parts is a from-scratch rewrite of the ideas of roboFab. And it exists really as an API that you can use to add on to a font editor. And so it's the scripting layer that is in RoboFont. If you pip install it, you get a thing called Font Shell, so it lets you run your scripts on UFOs on the command line. And Simon Cozens, who's also speaking at this conference, has made a thing called Babel Font, which is a front end to FontTools. FontTools scripting can be very difficult and fussy, but what's really nice about the Font Parts API is it's fairly simple, and it's been developed to prevent common problems. And so it does a lot of checking. Some people might say it's a little too much of a nanny, but it does a lot of things to help typeface designers who know some Python, but maybe not a lot of Python, things that are really useful quickly for their workflow. And I work with a lot of type designers that are not the most technical. They're not contributing to FontTools, but they can write code because they've learned a little bit of Python. So having this API layer, again, I think contributes to the commons in the sense that we're giving users tools that they can use that doesn't require a ton of investment. If you want to do scripting in FontTools, which is super powerful, and I love FontTools, it's not super well documented. You have to read all the source code to know what to do. I don't have a problem doing that. I enjoy that, but that's really not what 80% of the people writing Python for type design want to do. And so Font Parts has a website with documentation. That website was designed by both Vanavu and Stephen Nixon, who were interns for me at various times, and they worked on that. It doesn't have a great bit of tutorial, and it really needs those tutorials to help newcomers. So it is intimidating, and it's not perfect yet, but it is a thing. There's also Vanilla. And so vanilla is a Pythonic wrapper around Cocoa. And so what vanilla lets you do is write interfaces for Mac OS by writing Python code. So you never have to open up interface builder and you can make an application. So it's really powerful that way, and is actually the thing that drives RoboFont. And it drives a lot of UI stuff in glyphs for scripts. So that's vanilla. DEFCON is a set of UFO-based objects optimized for using in font editing applications. So once you read in a UFO, you want to do something with that data, you can need it in an object format so that you can change things or generate things from that UFO. So DEFCON is one library that does that. I should also say that FontTools is working on a library called UFOLib2, which is a very confusing name because it has nothing to do with UFOLib, but it is a much more lightweight version of DEFCON for when you really just need to do something on the command line and you need font objects. DEFCON is really made for a font editor or font editing application, so it's overkill in some cases, but that's what DEFCON is. There's extractor, because sometimes you want to go from a binary file to a UFO file. So extractor can be your thing, and it will extract from a bunch of different font formats. If that's something that you're interested in, be sure you also check FontTools, because FontTools will do some of that now also. There's UFO to FDK, which lets you take a UFO and run it to the Adobe FDK. Although I should say that now the Adobe FDK uses the UFO as a native format, so this package is not as necessary. There's Font Math, which lets you do math to fonts, glyphs, and other things, so that can be really useful for interpolation. And there's font pens. I'm going to end on font pens. Font pens are something that I really love. And so this is a specification and an idea that has been around for a really long time. It seems like every year more of these font pens tend to migrate over to FontTools. But font pens is a protocol that lets you do a bunch of things to glyph data. And so you can draw glyphs with font pens, you can get information about glyphs with font pens, you can draw, and when I say draw glyphs, you can actually like make glyphs, or you can draw them to different window managers. So you can have a WX pen that draws a glyph to a window in WX, or one that draws something to a window in Quartz or whatever. It can be drawing to screen, it can be actually drawing in the font, it can be filtering things. There's a filter pen in font pens, which is super useful if you've ever had to reduce the number of points in a font. Say you're working from something that has been scanned and auto-traced. Font pens are a really powerful way of manipulating font data in a really simple an abstract way. And again, it's this addition to the Commons that kind of lets us do our work. So I hope I've made sense. I really thank you for your time and attention. And I just want to say that there is a lot of value in doing something for the community. And I really encourage anyone who is interested in helping with any of these projects to email me, ben@xyztype.com, or open tickets or pull requests on GitHub. That's where everything happens. We would love any help. So this stuff has helped me as a type designer and has helped me in my career. So I work on these projects to give back. It's not the most exciting legacy, but it's something that helps the wider type community, and the type community has given me so much that I spend my time giving something back. So if that's something you're interested in, please contact us. We'd be happy for any help. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A, and I hope you're enjoying the conference. Thanks again.